Welcome to Scottish Independence Podcast. This week we're with Iain Bruce, the host of Rising Clyde, Scottish Climate Justice podcast series. And in this podcast, Iain is talking to Leonidas Iza, president of the main indigenous organisation CONAIE in Ecuador. Recently, the Ecuadorian people voted to leave the oil in the soil beneath their Yasuni National Park. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Here it is.
Hello and welcome to Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. I'm Iain Bruce in Glasgow. We have a busy period coming up, COP28 starting at the end of the month, the Global Day of Action at the end of that on the 9th of December, the Scottish Government's new climate plan still due out soon, although that seems to have slipped back into the beginning of next year. Today we're going to talk about a remarkable victory that should inspire us to face all of that. It's one of the most important steps forward for the movement against fossil fuels anywhere in the world in recent times. And it's now facing challenges, big challenges, that demand solidarity from those of us living here in Scotland and elsewhere in the global north. I'm talking about the referendum in Ecuador in August, in which almost 60% voted in favour of leaving the oil in the ground beneath the Yasuni National Park. That's an area of Amazon rainforest, about half the size of Wales. It's one of the most biodiverse spots on the planet, and it's also holding about 20% of Ecuador's oil reserves. We're going to be talking to one of the people who made that campaign a success. He's Leonidas Iza, the president of the main indigenous organisation, CONAIE. But first, here's a taste of that campaign that scored such a success on August the 20th.
Merci. Sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí y punto. Sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí y punto. Sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí y punto. Sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí a Yasuni, sí y punto. 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 Sí y punto.
Leonidas, thank you so much for being with us. Now, Leonidas, you were here in Scotland in July at the end of a visit to Europe, where you were promoting that campaign, Yes to Life, Yes to Yasuni, as well as launching your book, Uprising, which is about the two indigenous-led rebellions, uprisings in 2019 and 2022, which you, of course, were one of the main leaders of. Now, I remember on that trip, when you were here in Scotland, you said several times that the campaign for the Yasuni was, in a sense, a continuation of those two uprisings. So I want to start by asking you, how did the campaign for the Yasuni develop? In what sense was it a continuation of those uprisings in 2019 and 2022? And why was it so successful?
Saludos cordiales. Un abrazo a la comunidad internacional.
Hello, warmest greetings to our international friends. In fact, the triumph of the referendum on the Yasuni was the continuation of the struggles of 2019 and 2022, because the demands, especially in 2022, also had to do with looking after Mother Earth, looking after the forests and the highland moors. The extractive policies of the current outgoing government was what we were struggling against in 2022. If they want to implement extractive policies, whether oil or mining, there should be prior, free and informed consent, as laid out in the Charter of the United Nations, but also in the Ecuadorian Constitution.
El derecho a la consulta previa, libre e informada, como reza en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, pero también en la Constitución de la República. Es la continuación del 2022, porque en el acuerdo con el gobierno nacional habíamos...
In 2022, the agreement we had with the government was to develop a law to guarantee this prior, free and informed consent. But after a month, the government, instead of fulfilling that agreement, which we had signed, issued a decree. We argued that this was unconstitutional.
Él más bien emitió un decreto. Por eso habíamos demandado que es inconstitucional en el Ecuador. No permite...
In Ecuador, It's not allowed to regulate human rights or the rights of Mother Earth or collective rights through a decree, only through a law.
Por ello, hemos puesto con mucha fuerza.
So we've pushed for the government of Guillermo Lasso to understand that the agreements reached in the working groups set up after the uprising of 2022 had to be fulfilled, not avoided by using a decree, in this case Decree 754. And we won that case too. Now that decree has been suspended, and we are waiting for a final ruling from the Constitutional Court.
Esperando ya de fondo la respuesta de la Corte Constitucional. Por ello me parece importante que no podemos mirar el triunfo en la consulta por el Yasuni, no podemos mirar.
So we can't look at the triumph of the Yasuni referendum as a separate issue. It's part of the whole struggle for the rights of our territories, the right to defend Mother Nature, the ecological and climatic conditions of our country, but also to send a powerful message to the world.
Climáticas que tiene nuestro país, pero también enviar un mensaje potente a nivel mundial.
I want to come back to those topics you just mentioned, but I want to talk a little bit about the visit you made to Europe in July. And I want to ask you, well, actually, let's have a look at a little bit of a video from that visit first.
Hemos venido a una gira donde contiene la visita a diferentes colectivos, pero también una visita al Parlamento Europeo. En ese sentido creo que es importante evidenciar los procesos extractivos que están llevando muchas de las empresas del norte en nuestros países, minería, petróleo.
Sí ao Yasuni, sí á vida, sí aos povos indígenas, sí á natureza.
Movimento indígena por la dignidad.
Também nós dizemos sim à vida, sim ao Yasuni.
We are la vida, we are Yasuni. Que me ha dejado el sol.
We in the Scottish Trade Union Movement support our Ecuadorian sisters and brothers in their fight for justice, in their fight for equality, in their fight for ecology. We are with you all the way.
Yes to life! Yes to Yasuni! Sí a la vida! Sí a Yasuni!
So, Leonidas, on that visit to Europe in July, how much interest, concern did you find amongst the organizations, the politicians you met for this issue of the Yasuni, for the wider campaigns against mining and extractive industries? And what kinds of connections did you think could be built with those organizations?
Yo creo que la relación que ha tenido el tema de la consulta y la lucha contra la minería que ahora se ha levantado en el Ecuador, hay mucha receptividad a nivel internacional.
I think there's a lot of receptivity internationally to this referendum and the struggles against mining in Ecuador.
En Bélgica, en Inglaterra, en Escocia.
I want to thank the trade unions in Spain, Belgium, England, Scotland, in all the countries we've been to, of course in France as well.
Que están luchando en temas similares, como por ejemplo en Francia.
And there's also other movements who are struggling in a similar way. For example, in France, we talked to the comrades of the peasant organization who are struggling around water.
Y en efecto están luchando, por ejemplo, el tema del agua. Aquí el tema de la minería lo que tiene que ver es la lucha por la defensa del agua.
Here, the issue of mining is also about the defense of water and against privatizations. And in Europe, we see there's a very severe concentration of water because of the same system of production with monoculture and the same energy system.
Al menos creo que a partir de esa conversación que hemos tenido en la visita en el mes de julio,
I think that from the conversations we had on our visit in July, we've identified an international agenda to work on together in the coming years.
desde cada actor a nivel de Europa,
I think it's very important to establish a mechanism to coordinate with each movement in Europe and for them to be able to visit our communities as well. And for our colleagues from the indigenous movement to be able to take part in those global struggles too, because this is a global problem. People in Europe are very concerned about the effects of global warming, which of course not only affects the places where oil production and mining are located, the impact is worldwide.
Petróleo, las fuentes de minería, sino el efecto es a nivel mundial.
And that's why we said during our trip to Europe that it's very important that the central countries, the countries that are taking advantage of the resources of third world countries, must be co-responsible for the global impact.
Corresponsabilidad sobre el efecto global que es el cambio de la matriz energética. Pero en ese proceso, lógicamente...
In terms of a change in the energy system, they sometimes put forward the idea that it's possible to change the energy system just by using other resources, copper and other elements needed to run an electric system.
Para el tema de la electricidad. Por eso, creo, hermanos de la comunidad internacional...
So, brothers and sisters internationally, we think it's very important to understand it's a joint problem. It's not just an ecological issue, it's economic too. We think there are very good perspectives for working together internationally in a way that can bring together the demands of the indigenous movement with the demands of the trade unions, the workers, the peasants internationally.
Pero también las demandas de los sindicatos, de los trabajadores, de los campesinos a nivel internacional, a nivel global.
Since then, Leonidas, of course, since the victory of the Yasuni referendum, Ecuador has elected a new government, a new president, Daniel Noboa. He's young, rich, the heir to a huge banana exporting empire, and he'll be taking office in the coming weeks, and he's already promising an unashamedly neoliberal program of cuts and privatization. Now, he has said he'll respect the Yasuni vote, but he's also said, he hasn't said how and when he'll do that, and he has also said that he will use income from stepping up mining, other kinds of mining in other parts of the Amazon and other regions in order to make up the income lost from the Yasuni. So where does the Yasuni campaign and the anti-extractivist campaign stand now, and what do you think will happen with the new government?
Bueno, el nuevo presidente del Ecuador, él también es el beneficiario de la campaña por el Yasuni.
Well, the new president of Ecuador also benefited from the Yasuni campaign. He realized a couple of weeks before the elections that there was a tremendous support for the Yasuni issue, crushing support, more than 60%.
Fuerza por el Yasuni aplastante, que superaba más del 60%. En ese sentido, para aprovechar de esa fuerza.
So to take advantage of that, he came out in favour of Yasuni in the referendum, and he won some of the votes we had been gathering in support of the Yasuni for the referendum.
Dentro de la consulta del Yasuni. Y eso, lo que ahora corresponde es cumplir.
Now he has to deliver on that.
Con total alarma.
Because we've seen in a very worrying way how he's taking advantage of those votes, especially of those young people in the cities, people who are concerned about the effects of climate change.
Por el tema del efecto del cambio climático, y resulta que ahora quiere compensar los recursos que faltarían.
But now he says he wants to compensate for the income he'll stop getting from the oil of Block 43 in the Yasuni with more mining in the provinces of Loja, Zamora, Morona, Santiago and other places.
Por ejemplo, el proyecto Cóndor Mirador.
For example, the Cóndor Mirador project, where they are already building slag heaps that are going to reach a height of 263 metres, but with no proper structure to contain and support them. Those slag heaps are simply being dumped on earth platforms, and at some time they will collapse. And the incoming government says it's going to develop more of that kind of mining.
Y el gobierno nacional electo lo que ha dicho es que va a ir a profundizar esas formas del quehacer de la minería. Por ello debemos decir a la comunidad internacional.
So we have to say to the international community and to our own people, it's not enough that we won the referendum on oil drilling in the Yasuni to address the problem of climate change. The problem of the impacts on the ecosystem and the environment and the well-being of human beings is one integrated problem. You can't split it up by saying that, well, we'll save a bit of the forest by not getting oil out of Block 43, but we're going to destroy the mountains with other kinds of mining. That will not work.
Vamos a arrasar en la sierra. Eso no funciona. Aquí por ello hemos dicho, estamos demostrando con datos donde ¿Cuánto de todo lo que significa la riqueza en la minería, cuánto queda para el país?
That's why we're showing with facts how little all this mining wealth remains in the country for development, and how much is being taken away by the transnational companies. I'll give you an example. For each dollar that's invested in this country, those companies are earning $637. $1 for $637 in terms of income which they're taking away from Ecuador.
$637 por cada dólar. Esto es un insulto a las economías irrisorias del Ecuador.
That's a terrible blow to the Ecuadorian economy with the poverty we are facing. But that's what these transnational companies have done for years. They take advantage of the situation.
Aprovechando de esta situación. Por ello queremos decir a la comunidad internacional, no se puede apostar.
We want to say to the international community, you cannot save the forests but destroy the uplands.
El nuevo presidente Daniel Noboa.
The new president, Daniel Noboa, will have to face our responses in all our territories. So yes to the moorlands, yes to the water, yes to life. If we save Mother Nature, we will save life and save human beings. We should understand the proposals as a whole and the problems as a whole.
So, Leonidas, how do you see combining those two things? How does the struggle to protect the Yasuni, to stop the oil production, combine with the many local struggles against mining in different parts of Ecuador?
Bueno, hay una lucha de demanda nacional en donde estamos, en este caso, hermanados. Las nacionalidades de la Amazonía que defienden la selva.
So there's a series of national demands where we stand together as brothers and sisters, both the nationalities of the Amazon who defend the forest and the nationalities and peoples who defend the moorlands and the mountains and the coast. They're complementary. In the struggle against extractive industries, we come together in a countrywide struggle. That's why we've demanded a law to regulate all extractive industries.
Ahora, ¿cómo esto se territorializan las luchas? Lógicamente, en la Amazonía.
Of course, logically, the struggle against oil is more in Amazonia, although mining is advancing there too. You've only got to look at the province of Napo, where they destroyed the main river that goes past the most important city.
¿No es cierto que pasa esta ciudad más importante en la provincia del Napo? En ese proceso, lo que se ha logrado es evidenciar los problemas territoriales.
What we've managed to do is show the local problems caused by the oil drilling, the contamination of the water sources, the contamination of the soil, and the contamination of everything that people consume, which has caused illnesses like cancer and diabetes. It's changed people's eating habits and eroded their cultural habits.
Los patrones culturales, un deterioro cultural, todo aquello. Ahora avanzamos a la sierra. En la sierra, lo más jodido es el tema del agua.
And when we turn to the highlands, the Sierra, the biggest problem there is water. So that's the struggle in those territories, in the foothills between the mountains and the coast, and between the mountains and the Amazonia. These areas are very delicate ecologically, and there's only a small amount of arable land where you can cultivate crops and rear cattle.
Donde se puede hacer agricultura, donde se puede hacer ganadería. Pero además de aquello, si es que desaparece el agua.
If the water disappears from those very sensitive areas, then effectively we destroy people's livelihood in those territories.
Por ello, a partir de una lucha nacional, la lucha contra el extractivismo, pero visibilizando.
So, by showing the specific problems in each sector, in the coast, in the mountains, and in the Amazon, that allows us to undertake a national struggle rooted in each area.
Nacional, lógicamente enraizado en nuestros territorios que están luchando nuestra gente.
Leonidas, you mentioned just before in this interview that it's not possible to think of a transition away from fossil fuels that's simply to the benefit of the North at the cost of the South, which involves, invading and damaging, destroying community lands, indigenous lands, and so forth. So I wonder, if we agree that there does have to be a transition away from fossil fuels, we have to get rid of oil and gas and so forth, how can that be done while still respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and other communities in the South?
Bueno, yo creo que hay territorios que no se van a poder hacer minería ni petróleo.
Well, I think there are some areas where you won't be able to carry out either mining or oil drilling. not only where indigenous people live, but other sections of the population too. At least in Ecuador, there are areas where it's simply not possible to carry out mining, neither small scale, nor medium scale, nor large scale. If there are areas where you can develop these extractive industries, it has to be on the basis of a rigorous study to ensure that it does not affect the water and it doesn't contaminate the communities or the soil. And in Ecuador, which is a very small country, I think that's almost certainly impossible.
Yo le veo tremendamente imposible. Ahora miremos, solo vamos a Europa. ¿Cuánto de los territorios que permiten ecológicamente equilibrar la vida natural?
But if we look at Europe, how many of the areas that have a certain ecological balance have mining going on? Why haven't they developed mining in Europe on that scale? Or have they just used up all their minerals? We talked about this with comrades in Europe. Why haven't they developed mining there? There are whole mountains full of minerals. Why haven't they been exploited? Because effectively it would upset the ecological balance in those areas.
Desequilibrar la ecología, el medio ambiente en esa zona donde hay presencia minera. Entonces, debe haber aquí una conciencia social global.
So we have to have a global social awareness. It can't be split up just to favour some territories. We have to understand as human beings we need a common global awareness of this.
Ahora, en este tiempo, necesitamos una conciencia social global. El efecto inmediato.
The immediate impact of what we do in any part of the world is also global.
El efecto también es global. Por ello creo que en este momento la matriz energética para pasar a una matriz de energía limpia.
Therefore, I think that to move from one energy system to another, clean energy system, we have to see what's already been taken out of the earth. We have to go back and think about whether those same materials already taken out of Mother Earth, which have already been industrialized, could be the basis of a new system using new scientific methods.
Esas puedan ser una matriz donde se pueda seguir de acuerdo a la ciencia, ¿no es cierto?, sosteniendo la matriz energética en el mundo. Pero sacar nuevos procesos, acabar nuevos campos.
But developing new processes of extraction, destroying new areas of land, contaminating the land more, that's not a viable perspective. Science now has to be looking at how, without consuming more of Mother Earth's resources, we can guarantee a decent, basic existence for humanity.
Para que sostenga las condiciones de la humanidad. Aquí necesitamos la ciencia al servicio de la sociedad.
We need science at the service of society and humanity, not science that takes advantage of human thought to concentrate big economic resources in certain countries, and even worse, in the hands of certain individuals around the globe.
La madre tierra ya ha consumido.
Mother Earth has already seen 3 times its capacity for resources consumed. It's impossible to sustain that kind of production.
Por ello creemos importante en la discusión que ahora se tiene, no puede ir. Simplemente vamos a pasar a una matriz energética libre.
Therefore, we think it's important now to understand that we can't just go from an oil-based energy system to a clean energy system based on wind and other mineral products, while using the same quantity of resources as in the oil-based system.
Similares a lo que ha significado sacar el petróleo. Las montañas, exactamente lo mismo, juegan un papel.
Mountains play a fundamental role in the world, as do the river basins and the forests. So we shouldn't be taken in by this propaganda about clean energies without understanding what it means.
Si no estamos conscientes de lo que están diciendo.
Faced with the plans put forward by capitalism, we are going to defend our territories and defend life.
Vamos a defender la vida.
And I suppose that goes back to what you said right at the beginning about prior and free consultation, that the communities themselves have to control this process. Is that right?
Totalmente de acuerdo, y debe entenderse que la consulta previa, libre, informada no es un mecanismo.
I completely agree, and we have to be clear that prior, free and informed consent is not just a formality to be observed, because that's what many states have done. Governments say, oh well, we've carried out a prior consultation, but it's just a formality, and then they continue exploiting the mines and the oil.
Minería o petróleo. Aquí la consulta previa, libre, informada como demanda.
Prior, free and informed consent is stipulated by the United Nations, means that if people in a territory where the consultation is carried out with reliable information and without lies, if they say no, then that has to be binding. And then the state, the transnational companies, all of them have to respect that no.
Luego de conversar, la gente mirando los beneficios de contaminación y a partir de la contaminación.
If after people have talked it through and shared all the information, they decide that there's still a benefit in terms of development for their territory, and they say yes, then that has to be binding too. But it can't just be a formality.
Un formalismo para cumplir, pero luego de que la gente diga no, imponen desde la lógica del Estado y de las empresas privadas transnacionales, como hemos visto en nuestros territorios en estos tiempos. Es más, la consulta previa...
And we've seen that prior consultation is being used sometimes as a kind of carrot offered to the communities. Like it's Christmas and you give out a bag of sweets, get people to sign here and then say, that was the consultation. Even though the people have never really discussed in any depth what would happen to their area or what benefits might come to their communities.
Lo que va a suceder en sus territorios y jamás ha discutido los beneficios que van a significar en sus territorios en caso de darla. Por ello, nosotros demandamos.
That's why we're demanding prior, informed and free consultation where what the community says has to be binding.
De manera vinculante.
One other specific question, Leonidas, that's related to this I wanted to ask you is the question of subsidies. Now, a lot of people in the climate movement internationally say, no, we have to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies and so on and so forth. And the argument is understandable. But in the case of Ecuador, you can't just get rid of the subsidies. In the case of indigenous communities, for example, who rely on fuel at a certain price to get their products to market and so on and so forth. So what is CONAIE's policy on subsidies? Because I think that may be one of the points of conflict with the new government of Daniel Noboa, I understand.
Bueno, debemos entender en materia económica, en el Ecuador.
Well, we should understand that in the Ecuadorian economy, the prices of fuel affect all production.
¿Qué significa esto? Si en este momento...
What does it mean if we suddenly eliminate subsidies?
Eliminando el subsidio... A ver, en este momento está el precio del combustible...
For example, if the price of diesel is $1.75, for example, if we eliminate the subsidy, then the international market price might take it to about $5 a gallon.
¿Qué significa? Toda la matriz productiva.
That means a direct blow to the whole production system in Ecuador.
Directo. Significa que si un camión,
for example, a lorry carrying food from the uplands of the coast of the Amazon to market.
Distribuirla, ¿no es cierto? Ese camión que carga, yo que sé, $100 que alcanzaba ir a la costa, ahora tiene que...
If that transport costs $100, then now it will double. For example, and cost maybe $200. What does that mean? If my potatoes were worth $10 at the current price, then immediately, because of the increase in fuel price, the price of the potatoes will double.
Por el efecto inmediato, por el incremento del precio de los combustibles, lógicamente esas papas debería valer $20, duplica el precio. Entonces, aquí no es un problema para el que tiene un vehículo.
So here, it's not merely a problem for the owner of the vehicle. These subsidies don't benefit only those who operate a truck or machinery, but the whole Ecuadorian population.
Entonces, volviendo al mismo ejemplo.
So if you go back to the same example, if my potatoes double in price, the poorest people won't be able to buy their food.
A la alimentación. Entonces aquí está ligado directamente.
And the immediate effect will be on poverty, which hasn't been resolved, where already more than 2 million people in Ecuador cannot eat regularly 3 times a day. They may be eating only once or twice a day.
Más de 2 millones de personas en el Ecuador no pueden alimentarse establemente 3 veces al día. Apenas han comido 2 veces o a veces 1 vez al día. 2 millones de personas. Y si es que incrementa el precio...
If the cost of basic food increases, what's going to happen to those 2 million people who can't currently eat enough? Certainly they will not have access even to the minimum conditions of life.
Seguramente esa gente no va a tener mayor acceso a la alimentación.
That's why the international community has to understand that the question of subsidies is not a problem just for those who are using transport or using machinery. It has a direct impact on the poorest communities in our country.
En nuestro país, por la cual en el 2005...
Imagine, right back in 2005, there was a plan to deal with this. But 18 years later, we still haven't got over that form of dependency.
Pero no se ha resuelto salir de esta dependencia. ¿Qué se había dicho? Aquí se tiene que mirar con objetividad.
So we have to look at what objectively will be the policy of compensation for the poorest sectors.
Más empobrecidos. Por ejemplo, en las mesas de diálogo que llevamos...
In the working groups set up with the Lasso government after the big strike last year, there were 8 points, including some of the most important ones, that remained unresolved. The first of those was the elimination of subsidies for those people who have been taking advantage of them for the last 17 years, like the big prawn producers and the industrial fishing and tuna companies. Those three sectors alone consume $1.25 billion in subsidised fuel. So we wanted to see if those sectors, which are important parts of the Ecuadorian economy, could stop using the Ecuadorian people's money through those subsidies. And the money we got back from them could then be passed to the poorest sectors to compensate them. But after a year, we have made no progress in that. You know why? Because there are powerful economic sectors in our country who go on and on about how they want a free market and neoliberal policies, while their own wealth depends on subsidies paid by all the Ecuadorian people. So we proposed 3 or 4 initiatives. We said, let's start by focusing the subsidies. But they don't want to move forward on that because they know many of their own benefits depend on that, on them using the resources of the whole Ecuadorian people. We have to understand that you can't just eliminate subsidies in Ecuador because we haven't overcome structural poverty for the majority of the population, of the indigenous communities and other popular sectors. If that's not overcome, then when you increase the cost of fuel, everything goes up, food goes up, and it's impossible for the poorest people to pay. But there are sectors that can pay. If they don't have access to public health care, they can pay for a clinic, they can pay for a private hospital, no problem. There are people in Ecuador who are well off and taking advantage of such policies. If they can't get their children into state school, they can pay for private education and private universities. If they can't get hold of food from peasant producers, no problem, they'll import it. But that's not true for the majority, who don't have access to even the most basic things. So the question of subsidies is linked to structural poverty, and it could just provoke worse chaos and worse poverty.
Turning to the current situation, Leonidas, how do you see these struggles around subsidies, but in general, the struggles of all the demands of the indigenous movement and the popular movement? How do you see that developing in the coming month, the first half of next year? What do you see as the immediate future?
Bueno, nosotros ya hemos posesionado nuestras demandas.
Well, we've put forward our demands, the same demands that weren't resolved before and that were left hanging by the outgoing president.
Bajo la tutela del presidente de la República saliente y que en esos debates incluso...
And in those talks, the economic powers that are now defending the incoming government also put forward their proposals.
Sostuvieron sus propuestas. Entonces, por ello ha habido una avalancha.
Now there's been an avalanche of criticism against the indigenous movement, with people saying, well, the president-elect hasn't even taken office yet, and yet CONAIE already has its 15 demands. We have said that in a democracy that, like ours, is tremendously violent, if you can call it a democracy at all, we recognise that there is a new government, but they also have to recognise there is a whole series of unresolved structural demands. They won't be resolved in the year and a half that this new government will have, but we have to ensure at least the minimum conditions to give people some relief. That's what we've argued, and why we're very concerned that some sectors, instead of moving forward with these proposals that we've been discussing with previous governments, have begun to quibble over this text or that, and not about reality. The reality shows that we have a terrible situation of insecurity. a reality dominated by the drug gangs. And who's connected to that? It's the same big, powerful economic groups who benefited from the policies in the past. So we have 4 points that we have put forward most forcefully to the incoming government. Firstly, the issue of extractive industries on land that's environmentally sensitive, on indigenous land or land where peasant production is concentrated. There must be none of that there. This has to be clear to the incoming president. Secondly, we can't have any more privatisations. Instead of thinking about selling those assets for a knockdown price, the government should be thinking about revitalising the public enterprises so that they can provide benefits. Den beneficio a partir de la repotenciación de estas iniciativas. Tercer tema que hemos dicho. The third theme we will put forward is that it's not acceptable to privatise the social security system in Ecuador that depends on the contribution of the workers. The workers' funds have been manipulated by previous governments, but now they must be accountable and we cannot have any more privatisation. The fourth theme we've put forward very responsibly to the government is the need for a policy of debt relief. More than 2 million families in Ecuador depend on credit, whether from private banks or public banks or cooperative banks. If these are to remain afloat, there has to be a policy of debt relief so that people can continue to pay, but in terms they can manage. Not by over-exploiting people and even confiscating their goods if they can't pay.
And if President Noboa does not meet those 4 points, do you expect to see another round of big mobilizations led by the indigenous movement?
Bueno, por ahora he dicho estos cuatro temas que serían prioritarios dentro de
Well, I've mentioned those 4 demands as priorities at the moment, amongst the overall list of 15 demands that we put forward publicly, which were part of the working groups agreed with the Ecuadorian government after the strike, but which the government has not fulfilled. So at the moment we are prioritising those 4 topics, but that may change.
Hay una demanda integral. De estos vamos priorizando en el tiempo que corresponda, ¿no es cierto? Ahora, frente al incumplimiento o a la respuesta que puede dar el nuevo presidente.
If the government doesn't meet these demands, we will have to make an evaluation based on what the government has done and how much people are prepared to put up with and how far they will tolerate these neoliberal policies.
Luego que la gente realmente no esté dispuesta a soportar, a sostener las políticas neoliberales.
As things develop, we will take a position. I can't say now whether it will be a mobilisation, an uprising, or what it will be. We can't anticipate that.
Siempre el movimiento indígena ha actuado.
The indigenous movement has always sought dialogue first, a process of transparent, responsible talks to solve the problems. But when the government refuses to listen, it has also moved to mobilise people. For the moment, our proposals and demands are public, and we've listened to the public responses so far, where they are trying to divide us. But they shouldn't think they can do the same as previous governments have tried to do. Those governments have fallen, and we will maintain our unity in whatever situation and with any of those different forms of struggles that have occurred in Ecuador in recent years, including those 2 big uprisings. We don't rule anything out. It will depend on the decision taken by our people at a national level.
And do you think it will be possible to overcome those divisions that have affected the indigenous movement, the social movement, the left in Ecuador in recent times?
Es posible, es una necesidad urgente.
It's possible, it's necessary, it's urgent. And in fact, if we don't overcome this bipolar opposition, which the right has managed to instill, they are the only ones who benefit. The popular classes, the poor in Ecuador, will continue to suffer from the neoliberal policies. It's not a question of, I defend this position and you defend that one. No, it's a question of concrete reality. We need to address the problems of the majority of Ecuadorian people. Otherwise, we will remain trapped in this idea that the right is taken advantage of, this idea of being for or against the previous president, Rafael Correa. The only people who benefit from that are the right. They've managed to instill a right-wing ideology in some of the poorest sections in Ecuador, in some of the grassroots of the indigenous movement and other popular movements as well. And it's shameful when we see some movements and parties who claim to be of the left, but who campaign alongside President Lasso or alongside the incoming President Noboa. They don't say, "Oh no, we were wrong, we made a mistake." Because what we need now is an integrated proposal where people are prepared to put forward and defend their demands. There is a really urgent need for unity amongst all sectors of the peoples: whites, mestizos, indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and all the different identities, but always firmly located on the side of the people, because it's the people who are the majority and who feel the most negative effects of the implementation of neoliberal policies by all the recent governments.
And one final question, Leonidas. What concrete tasks are you proposing or asking your international partners, organizations, trade unions around the world to do to support your struggles in Ecuador?
Well, first of all, I want to recognize the efforts that were made during our visit. The outstanding task now is to coordinate internationally, so that it's not just a few leaders in Ecuador, but we have a real international network to communicate the voices of the real concrete struggles. There are some demands which are specific to Ecuador, but there are also many demands around opposition to extractivism, around climate change, around the struggle against transnational companies, which are demands which have to be put forward internationally. That's why it seems important to me, this question of strengthening the capacity to combine our voices internationally around our demands in Ecuador, but also around these international demands on the global impacts of climate change, the energy framework, the extractive industries, and so forth. The second topic that we dealt with is the possibility of establishing a mechanism of unity at an international level, an international platform where we can identify the struggles we are taking part in and bring together organizations internationally around those. And the third theme was that there should be a strategic campaign in the area of communications, where we can share communications and messages from local communities, not only across Ecuador and Latin America, but in countries across the world. I think those were the main activities proposed. And a fourth one was for experience of exchanges between the struggles located in our countries of the Third World, in Ecuador for example, and also the experiences of struggle in Europe. In that sense, we want to establish a mechanism of direct relations between the struggles in Europe and in our countries like Ecuador. And maybe the leaders who emerge around these new experiences and exchanges with other countries can be leaders who are aware and sensitive, not only to our own struggles here in Ecuador, but also to the global struggles. As I've said, we need people, individuals, and collective groups with a global social awareness. We can't remain trapped in partial struggles the whole time. These are, of course, very important in themselves. But those struggles will be much more effective when we can globalize the awareness.
Thank you so much, Leonidas. Muchísimas gracias, Leonidas. It's been a really fascinating conversation, full of things to think about and lessons to learn for us in the north, and to try and develop those with yourselves in Ecuador and other parts of the global south. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of this edition of Rising Clyde. I'm Iain Bruce in Glasgow. Until next time, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
So thank you very much to everyone internationally for this internationalist spirit. Let's unite our struggles. A big embrace from the territory here of the people of the perpendicular sun, as we call the indigenous Quito people of this area. Many thanks from Ecuador.
Gracias, Leonidas. Ciao.
You've been listening to Scottish Independence Podcasts, and this week we were with Iain Bruce, host of Rising Clyde, the Scottish Environmental Justice Programme. If you'd like to hear more of our podcasts on the theme of climate emergency and environmental justice, head over to the website. It's called scottishindiepod.scot and have a look at our climate emergency playlist.